He wasn't supposed to be found. Not here. Not like this. Wrapped in a black plastic bag behind a hospital that saved lives by daylight and forgot the world by night. The rain had started just after midnight, soft at first, then steady, tapping against metal lids and concrete like a quiet confession no one wanted to hear. The alley smelled of rust, damp cardboard, and something colder than the air itself, something abandoned. Most people passed that narrow service road without a glance, headlights sliding over it like it didn't exist. But Rex didn't pass. He stopped, mid-step, muscles locked, ears forward. Not fear, not curiosity, recognition. The kind that doesn't come from training or commands or anything a human ever taught him. It came from somewhere deeper, older. Ethan Cole noticed the shift before he understood it. He always did. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, his voice low, worn from too many nights without sleep. He stood just over 6 feet, shoulders broad under a faded jacket, the kind issued years ago and never quite let go. His right arm, bare beneath the rolled sleeve, carried the ink of a German shepherd, sharp lines, steady gaze. The kind of tattoo you don't get unless something once saved your life. Or still was. Rex didn't answer. He never barked without reason. Instead, he stepped closer to the dumpster, nose twitching once, then again, slower this time, as if confirming what he already knew. The rain slicked his dark coat, tracing along the strong line of his back, but he didn't shake it off. Didn't move away. Ethan followed, boots crunching softly on wet gravel, his breath visible in the cold air. "Probably just trash," he said, more to himself than the dog, though something in his chest tightened before he even reached the lid. He had learned, a long time ago, that when Rex stopped like this, it was never just anything. Rex lowered his head. Then, gently, almost carefully, he nudged the edge of a torn bag that had slipped halfway open. Not digging. Not tearing. Just enough. Ethan crouched, a slow, deliberate motion, as if the night itself might break if he moved too fast. The sound came then, so faint it could have been mistaken for wind, slipping through broken plastic. But it wasn't wind. It was smaller, fragile, a breath that didn't belong out here. Ethan froze. His hand hovered midair, fingers inches from the bag. "No," he whispered, not as denial, but as a quiet prayer that he was wrong. Rex didn't move. He just looked at him, and in that look, there was no doubt. Ethan pulled the plastic back. The world narrowed instantly. A baby, tiny, wrapped in layers that were never meant to protect. Skin pale from the cold, lips barely holding color, chest rising so lightly it almost didn't count as breathing at all. For a second, just one, Ethan didn't move. His mind betrayed him, dragging him somewhere else, somewhere louder, hotter, filled with dust and echoes and a moment he had buried but never escaped. A child he hadn't reached in time. A cry that had stopped too soon. His jaw tightened. His vision blurred just enough to make the present feel like memory. Rex let out a low, almost inaudible whine. Not panic. Not fear. A reminder. Ethan exhaled sharply, grounding himself. "No more," he said under his breath, the words rough, like they had edges. He reached in, hands steady now, and lifted the child with a care that didn't belong in a place like this. The baby weighed almost nothing. Too light, too still, but not gone. Not yet. He pressed the small bundle against his chest, instinct overriding everything else, his body shielding what little warmth remained. "Stay with me," he murmured, though he didn't know if the words were for the child or for himself. Rex stayed close, flank brushing against Ethan's leg as they moved, a silent anchor in the rain. The hospital doors slid open with a sterile hiss, bright lights spilling into the night like a different world entirely. Inside, everything smelled clean, controlled, safe. But Ethan knew better than most that safety was never guaranteed, not even here. "Help," he called, voice cutting through the quiet lobby. Heads turned. Footsteps rushed. Hands reached. The baby was taken from him gently, quickly, carried into a space filled with machines and soft commands and urgency that didn't feel frantic, just practiced. Ethan stood just outside, chest still. Rising too fast, arms suddenly empty. Rex sat beside him, perfectly still, eyes fixed on the doorway as if he could see beyond it. Time stretched. Seconds felt longer than they should. A monitor beeped somewhere inside, steady at first, then slower. Someone spoke in a tone too calm. Too final. Ethan swallowed hard, his right hand unconsciously gripping his forearm, fingers pressing against the tattoo etched into his skin. "Come on," he whispered, barely audible. Rex shifted slightly, pressing closer, not looking at Ethan, still watching the room, like he knew something the rest of them didn't. And for the first time that night, Ethan realized the dog hadn't hesitated. Not once. The hallway outside the emergency room felt colder than the rain had been, a different kind of chill that came from fluorescent lights and quiet decisions made behind closed doors. And Ethan Cole stood there without moving, his shoulders squared but heavy, as if the weight of something unseen had settled over him again, the kind of weight he thought he had left behind years ago, while Rex remained seated at his side, still as stone, eyes fixed on the narrow glass panel of the door, watching, waiting, not for permission, not for instruction, but for something else entirely, something only he seemed to understand. And inside the room voices moved in low tones, calm and controlled, the language of people trained to face the edge between staying and slipping away. But there was a difference tonight, something subtle, something off rhythm, like a song missing its final note, and Ethan could feel it without hearing a single word clearly, his fingers curling slightly against his palm, brushing the raised lines of the tattoo on his right arm, the ink worn but alive, a mirror of the dog sitting beside him, a reminder of a bond that had carried him through things no training ever prepared him for. And then the sound came, not loud, not dramatic, just a shift in tone, a change in pace, footsteps slowing instead of rushing, voices lowering instead of rising. And Ethan's chest tightened as he leaned forward just enough to catch a glimpse through the glass, where a nurse adjusted a blanket with careful hands, and a doctor stood at the monitor, still, too still, the kind of stillness that said more than any words could, and for a moment time seemed to pause, stretching thin, fragile, like it could break if anyone moved too quickly. And Ethan swallowed, his throat dry, his breath shallow, as memories pressed in again, uninvited, a different room, a different child, a different ending that had never left him. And he closed his eyes briefly, not to escape, but to steady himself, to stay present this time, to not look away, because this time there was still a chance, however small it might be. And beside him Rex shifted, just once, a quiet movement that drew Ethan's attention back. And when he looked down, the dog was no longer staring at the door, but at him, directly, with a calm that did not match the moment, with certainty that did not belong in a place like this. And Ethan felt it then, not as a thought, but as something deeper, a quiet pull, like a thread being tightened, between what had happened and what was about to. And he stepped closer to the door without thinking, one hand lifting slightly, as if reaching for something he could not see. And inside the monitor gave a soft, flat tone that lingered just long enough to settle into the room. And no one rushed, no one panicked, because sometimes the absence of sound says everything. And a nurse lowered her gaze. The doctor exhaled slowly, and Ethan's heart dropped in a way that felt familiar and final all at once. And he shook his head once, barely, as if refusing to accept what had not yet been spoken aloud. "Not this time," he whispered, the words almost lost in the quiet. And Rex stood, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with purpose, stepping forward until his nose nearly touched the door, his ears forward, his body aligned in a way that spoke of focus, not fear. And then he let out a soft, low sound, not a bark, not a whine, something in between, something that seemed to reach past the barrier of glass and steel. And inside the room one of the nurses paused, just for a second, her hand hovering above the small form on the bed, as if she had felt something she could not explain. And Ethan saw it, that hesitation, that flicker, and his breath caught as he pressed his palm flat against the door, right over the ink of the dog etched into his skin, and the contact grounded him, anchored him to the moment. And then it happened, so small it could have been missed, so quiet it could have been imagined. But it was real, because Ethan saw it with his own eyes, the tiniest movement, a slight curl of fingers, barely a twitch, but enough to break the stillness, enough to shift the air in the room. And the nurse leaned in closer, her expression changing not to shock, but to focus, sharp and immediate. "Wait," she said, her voice steady but different now. And the doctor turned back to the monitor, eyes narrowing, searching. And there it was, not a full rhythm, not yet, but something, a flicker, a trace, a return that did not make sense by any standard they understood. And Ethan felt his chest rise with a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his hand still pressed to the door, his other hand tightening at his side. And Rex lowered himself slowly back to the floor, calm again, as if the outcome had never been in doubt, as if this moment had already been decided long before they ever reached that alley. And the room inside shifted from stillness to motion once more, not chaotic, but deliberate, precise, voices returning, hands moving. The quiet language of second chances spoken without words, and Ethan leaned his forehead briefly against the cool surface of the glass, eyes closed, not in relief, not yet, but in something closer to belief, the kind that does not come easily, the kind that has to be earned. And when he opened his eyes again, Rex was no longer looking at the door, but at him, just for a moment, before turning back, as if to say it was not over yet, but they were not alone in it anymore. The room did not return to silence again, but it did not return to certainty either, and that fragile space in between became the place where everything now existed, where every breath, every flicker on the monitor, every subtle shift carried more weight than it should, and Ethan Cole remained where he was, just outside the door, not stepping in, not stepping away, as if crossing that threshold might change something he did not yet understand, while Rex stayed close, his presence steady, grounded, unshaken by the urgency moving on the other side of the glass. And inside, the doctor leaned closer to the small form on the bed, eyes sharp, hands precise, no longer accepting what had almost been declared, but not yet trusting what had returned. And the nurse adjusted the blanket again, this time not as a gesture of closure, but of protection, as if the child now belonged to something more than the moment. And Ethan watched, his gaze fixed, unblinking, as the monitor gave a faint, irregular rhythm that did not promise anything, but refused to disappear, and it was enough, just enough to hold on to, enough to keep him from drifting back into that place in his memory where things ended too soon. And he felt it again, that pull, that quiet thread connecting him to this child, to this night, to something that felt less like chance and more like purpose. And he exhaled slowly, steadying himself, while his hand once again found the tattoo on his right arm, fingers tracing the outline without looking, grounding himself in something real, something that had never failed him. And Rex shifted his weight slightly, his ears tilting just a fraction as if listening to something beneath the surface, something beyond the sounds of machines and voices. And Ethan noticed it, the same way he had noticed it in places far from here, in moments when instinct mattered more than logic, when the difference between waiting and acting could not be explained, only felt. And for a brief second the world narrowed again, not to the past, but to the present, to the exact point where everything could still change. And then the door opened, not wide, just enough for a nurse to step out, her expression composed but not distant, her eyes meeting Ethan's with a kind of recognition that had not been there before. "She is still with us," she said, her voice calm, but carrying something deeper, something almost reverent. And Ethan nodded once, not trusting himself to speak yet, while Rex remained seated, watching her, not as a stranger, but as part of the unfolding moment. And the nurse hesitated for just a second before adding, "We do not know why, but she is fighting." And that word lingered in the air longer than it should have, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. And Ethan felt it settle somewhere inside him, not as relief, not yet, but as a shift, a change in direction that he could not ignore. And he stepped forward, slowly, crossing the threshold this time, not as a man reacting, but as someone choosing to stay. And inside, the room felt smaller, quieter, focused entirely on the fragile life at its center. And the baby lay there, wrapped now in clean blankets, her skin no longer as pale, though still delicate, still uncertain. And the monitor beside her continued its uneven rhythm, each beat soft but present, like footsteps returning from a long distance. And Ethan approached the bedside, his movements careful, almost instinctive, as if he already knew how to exist in this space. And Rex followed, stopping just at the edge of the room, not stepping too close, not interfering, simply watching, always watching. And Ethan looked down at the child, really looked this time, not through the lens of urgency or fear, but with something quieter, something deeper. And he saw it then, something that made his breath catch just slightly, not because it was obvious, but because it felt familiar in a way he could not explain. The way her small hand rested against the blanket, the slight curl of her fingers, the way her chest rose and fell with effort but determination. And without thinking, he reached out, placing his hand gently beside hers, not touching it first, just close enough to feel the warmth, to confirm she was truly here, truly alive. And for a moment nothing happened, the room holding its breath once again, suspended between what had been and what might be. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, her fingers moved, not a reflex, not random, but deliberate enough to be seen, to be felt, and they brushed against his hand, barely, but enough to send something through him that he had not felt in a very long time. Something steady, something undeniable, and Ethan did not pull away, did not speak, did not question it. He simply stayed there, his hand resting beside hers, allowing the moment to exist without needing to understand it. And behind him Rex lowered himself to the floor, his head resting between his paws, eyes still open, still watchful, but softer now, as if the tension that had carried him to that alley had finally eased, as if the outcome he had known from the beginning was now unfolding exactly as it was meant to. And the doctor, standing just a few feet away, observed quietly, his earlier certainty replaced with something else entirely, something closer to humility. And after a long moment he spoke, not loudly, not with authority, but with honesty. "Sometimes," he said, glancing briefly at Ethan and then at Rex, "we do not get to decide when something is over." And no one responded, because there was nothing to add, nothing to explain, only the quiet presence of a life that had almost been lost and yet remained, held not by force, not by chance alone, but by something that did not need a name to be real. And Ethan remained there, hand beside hers, eyes steady, no longer haunted by what he had failed to save, but anchored in what he had not walked away from this time. And for the first time that night, the weight on his shoulders did not disappear, but it shifted, becoming something he could carry, something he was meant to. Morning did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, filtering through the narrow windows in pale strips of light that softened the edges of the room. And for the first time since the night began, the air felt different, not lighter, not safe, but no longer holding its breath. And Ethan Cole had not moved far from where he stood, his hand still resting near the small fingers that had found him hours earlier, his posture no longer tense but steady, as if he had settled into something he did not expect to stay for. While Rex remained close, stretched out along the floor with his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but never fully asleep, always aware, always present, and the steady rhythm from the monitor had grown stronger, not perfect, not yet, but consistent enough to carry hope without forcing it. And the nurses moved with a quieter confidence now, their voices low but no longer uncertain, their hands no longer hovering but working with intention. And one of them paused beside Ethan, offering a brief glance toward the child before speaking softly. "She made it through the night." And the words settled gently, without celebration, without disbelief, just truth. And Ethan nodded once, his gaze never leaving the small form before him, because even now he understood that survival was not a moment. It was a process, a fragile line that could still shift, and he had learned long ago not to claim victory too soon. But something inside him had changed, something that no longer expected loss as the only ending. And he let out a slow breath, feeling it fully this time, grounding himself in the present rather than bracing for what might follow. And Rex lifted his head slightly, sensing the shift not in the room, but in Ethan himself. And for a brief moment their eyes met, a quiet exchange that did not need words, because it had been built over years of trust. And Ethan reached down, his hand brushing against the dog's neck in a simple, steady gesture, not gratitude, not reassurance, but recognition, as if acknowledging that whatever had happened last night had not been chance. And Rex responded the way he always did, not with excitement, not with movement, just a slow blink and a subtle shift closer, grounding, steady, certain. And across the room the doctor reviewed the chart again, his expression thoughtful rather than clinical, as if the numbers in front of him did not fully explain what he had witnessed. And he glanced toward Ethan once more, not as a stranger, but as someone connected to the outcome in a way he could not measure. and after a moment he stepped closer, his voice calm but carrying a quiet respect. "She is stable for now," he said, choosing his words carefully. "And that is more than we expected." And Ethan finally looked up, meeting his gaze, not searching for answers, not questioning, just listening. And the doctor hesitated slightly before continuing. "We will need to monitor her closely, but she is responding." And Ethan nodded again, this time with a slight tightening of his jaw, not from tension, but from resolve, because the uncertainty did not push him away, it anchored him further, and he turned his attention back to the child, observing the subtle changes, the color returning faintly to her skin, the steadier rise and fall of her chest, the way her small hand no longer lay completely still, but shifted slightly against the blanket as if testing the world she had been brought back into. And he moved his hand closer again, not to guide, not to interfere, just to be there. And once more her fingers found him, slower this time, weaker but intentional, and he held that contact gently, allowing it to remain without forcing it into something more, because he understood now that presence was enough. And across the room a quiet conversation unfolded between the staff, words like unexpected and remarkable spoken not with excitement, but with careful consideration, as if they were trying to place what had happened within the boundaries of what they knew. And finding those boundaries did not quite hold, and the nurse who had first spoken earlier returned, her gaze softening slightly as she looked at the child, then at Ethan. "Do you have a name?" she asked, not formally, not as part of a process, but as something more human, more immediate. And Ethan paused, the question settling into him in a way he had not anticipated, because until that moment the child had been survival, urgency, presence, but not identity. And he looked down at her again, really seeing her now not just as someone he had found, but someone who was here, someone who would need more than just this moment. And his mind searched briefly, not for something clever, not for something fitting, but for something that felt right, something that carried the weight of what had happened without needing to explain it. And his gaze shifted briefly to Rex, then back to the child. And he spoke quietly, his voice steady. "Hope." And the word did not echo, did not demand attention. It simply settled into the room like it belonged there, like it had been waiting. And the nurse nodded once, writing it down without comment, as if understanding that some names are not chosen, they are recognized. And Rex lifted his head slightly at the sound, his ears tilting forward just enough to acknowledge it. And then he rested again, calm, certain, as if the story had moved into a new chapter he had already accepted. And Ethan remained where he was, his hand still beside hers, no longer holding on out of fear, but staying because he chose to. And outside the window the morning light grew stronger, touching the edges of the room, illuminating the quiet space where something small, fragile, and almost lost had found its way back, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with a presence that spoke louder than anything else. And in that stillness Ethan understood something he had not been able to before, that not every battle was meant to be fought with strength. Some were meant to be held with patience, with presence, with a refusal to walk away. And he did not look at the past again, because for the first time it was not pulling him back. It was standing behind him, no longer something to escape, but something that had led him here, to this room, to this moment, to this life that had not been left behind. The hours that followed did not rush forward. They unfolded slowly, measured not by clocks but by breaths, by the quiet rhythm of a life that had nearly slipped away and was now learning how to remain. And Ethan Cole stayed through all of it, not out of obligation, not out of uncertainty, but because something in him had already made the decision long before his mind caught up. And the room shifted around him as morning turned to afternoon, light moving across the walls in steady increments, softening the edges of everything it touched, while Rex remained a constant presence at his side, occasionally lifting his head, adjusting his position, but never straying far, as if whatever had guided him to that alley had not yet fully released its hold. And hope, small and fragile, but undeniably present, rested beneath layers of warmth and care, her breathing more even now, her movements still slight, but no longer uncertain. And the staff moved with a different energy, no longer cautious in the same way, but respectful, aware that what they were witnessing did not fit neatly into expectation. And from time to time someone would pause, just for a moment, to look a little longer than necessary, to confirm with their own eyes what had once seemed impossible. And Ethan noticed these things without focusing on them, because his attention remained where it had been since the beginning, steady, unwavering, anchored beside the child who had somehow found him in the middle of a night that had felt like it belonged to no one. And a social worker arrived quietly in the early afternoon, her presence gentle but purposeful, carrying a clipboard and questions that were necessary but not urgent, and she introduced herself with a calm tone, acknowledging what had happened without trying to define it. And she asked Ethan where he had found the baby, how long ago, whether there had been anyone else, and Ethan answered simply, without embellishment. His words direct, grounded, because the details mattered but they were not the center of what had taken place. And when she asked if he knew anything about the child's family, he paused briefly, glancing down at Hope, then at Rex, before shaking his head, because the truth was he did not know anything about where she had come from, only that she had been found, and that had been enough to change everything. And the social worker nodded, writing quietly, her expression thoughtful but not distant, as if she understood that some stories begin in places no one can explain. And she assured him that they would do everything necessary to find answers, to ensure the child would be safe, cared for, protected. And Ethan listened, but something in him had already moved beyond the question of what would happen next, because for him, this was no longer about circumstance. It was about connection. And as the conversation ended, she hesitated for a moment before asking, "Will you be staying?" And the question lingered, not as a demand, but as an acknowledgement of what had already been unfolding. And Ethan looked at Hope again, at the small rise and fall of her chest, at the way her fingers occasionally moved, as if reaching for something unseen. And then he glanced at Rex, whose steady presence had not wavered since the night began, and he gave a quiet nod. "Yes," he said, his voice calm, certain, not because he had considered every outcome, but because he did not need to. And the social worker accepted the answer without surprise, as if she had expected nothing less, and she left the room with the same quiet purpose she had entered, allowing the moment to return to what it had become, a space defined not by urgency, but by presence. And as the afternoon light softened further, Ethan found himself seated beside the bed, his posture relaxed for the first time in a way that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome. And he spoke occasionally, not full sentences, not conversations, just quiet words, simple, steady, as if the sound of his voice itself might matter. And Rex shifted closer, resting his head near Ethan's boot, his eyes drifting between the child and the man, always aware, always connected. And the doctor returned once more, reviewing the latest readings with a slight nod, acknowledging the progress without overstating it. And he paused beside Ethan, his voice lower now, less clinical, more reflective. "She is stronger than she looks," he said, and Ethan allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to form, not from relief, not from certainty, but from recognition, because strength does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in moments no one expects. And as the day moved toward evening, the room grew quieter. Again, not empty, but settled, and the world outside continued as it always did, unaware of the small, profound shift that had taken place within these walls. And Ethan remained there, not watching the clock, not waiting for anything else to happen, simply staying. Because for the first time in a long while, staying did not feel like hesitation, it felt like purpose. And beside him Rex finally closed his eyes for more than a moment, resting fully now, as if the watch he had kept since the beginning had come to its natural end, not because the story was finished, but because it had found its direction. And in that quiet, steady space, with light fading gently beyond the window and the soft rhythm of breathing filling the room, Ethan understood something without needing to say it, that sometimes the lives we are meant to protect are not the ones we are sent to find, but the ones that somehow find us when we are ready to stay. Evening settled over the hospital in a quiet, unannounced way, the kind that dimmed the edges of everything without asking permission. And the room where Ethan Cole sat did not change much in appearance, but something deeper had shifted, something that could not be seen in the monitors or measured in charts. And Hope lay resting more peacefully now, her breathing steadier, her small chest rising and falling with a rhythm that no longer felt borrowed, while the soft glow of a bedside lamp replaced the sharper light of the day, wrapping the room in a calm that felt earned rather than given, and Ethan remained beside her, his posture relaxed but attentive, his presence no longer driven by urgency, but by something quieter, something more enduring, and Rex lay close as always, though now fully at ease, his breathing slow, his body no longer carrying the tension of the night that had brought them here. And from time to time he would open his eyes, not in alertness, but in quiet acknowledgement, as if checking that everything remained as it should, and each time his gaze would settle briefly on Hope before returning to rest, and the sounds of the hospital continued beyond the walls, distant footsteps, soft voices, the hum of machines. But inside this room everything felt contained, held within a moment that did not need to expand, and Ethan found himself watching the smallest details. The way Hope's fingers curled and uncurled against the blanket, the faint movement of her lips as if responding to something unseen, the subtle shift of her head when the air changed slightly, and he realized that these quiet signs held more meaning than anything loud ever could, because they were real, they were present, they were here, and he spoke to her again, not in full sentences, not in explanations, just simple words carried on a steady tone, telling her she was not alone, that she had been found, that she was safe, even if she could not yet understand. And something about saying those words felt different this time, not like a promise he hoped to keep, but like a truth he was already living. And Rex lifted his head at the sound of Ethan's voice, his ears tilting slightly, not reacting, but listening, always listening. And after a moment he rose slowly, stretching once before stepping closer to the bed, his movement deliberate, careful, and he rested his head gently near the edge, close enough to feel the warmth without intruding, and Hope stirred slightly at the shift, her fingers moving again, this time brushing lightly against the air until they found the edge of the blanket near where Rex rested. And for a brief second the contact was there, soft, almost accidental, but enough to connect something unseen, and Rex did not move away, did not react, he simply stayed, allowing the moment to exist as it was, and Ethan watched, his expression softening in a way that did not need to be explained, because he understood now that this connection was not something to question, it was something to witness, and time moved forward quietly, the hours blending together without urgency, and a nurse entered briefly to check on Hope, her movements gentle, her voice low as she noted the improvements, each small change acknowledged without exaggeration, and she glanced at Ethan with a faint smile that spoke more of respect than reassurance, as if recognizing that his presence had become part of the rhythm of the room. And when she left, the silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It was full, filled with breath, with presence, with something steady and undeniable, and Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, his hand resting once more beside Hope's, not reaching, not guiding, just there, and he felt the subtle warmth of her skin, the quiet confirmation that she remained, and for a moment his thoughts drifted, not to the past in the way they once had, but to something else, something ahead, something he had not allowed himself to consider before. And it did not come as a plan, not as a series of steps, but as a simple understanding that whatever came next, he would not walk away from it, not this time. And Rex settled again on the floor, closer than before, his body angled toward both Ethan and Hope, as if guarding something that did not need protection but deserved it anyway. And outside the window the last light faded, replaced by the quiet glow of the city beyond, distant and unaware, and inside the room the steady rhythm of breathing continued, unremarkable to anyone else, but everything to those who had witnessed how close it had come to stopping. And Ethan closed his eyes for just a moment, not from exhaustion, but from something closer to peace, a feeling he had not allowed himself in a long time. And when he opened them again, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. And he looked at Hope, then at Rex, and he did not need to say anything, because some moments do not require words, they only require that you stay, that you remain present long enough to see what is quietly unfolding. And in that stillness, with nothing demanding his attention and nothing pulling him away, Ethan understood that this was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something he had not known he was waiting for, something that had arrived without warning, carried not by certainty, but by a simple, unshakable truth, that sometimes the smallest lies are the ones that change everything, not through force, not through noise, but through the quiet way they choose to remain. The night deepened again, not with the same uncertainty it had carried before, but with a quiet steadiness that settled over the room like something earned, something fragile yet unshaken. And Ethan Cole remained where he had chosen to be, his presence no longer tied to urgency, but to something far more deliberate, something that did not ask for permission or explanation. And Hope slept more peacefully now, her small form no longer fighting for each breath, but resting into it, her chest rising and falling with a rhythm that felt almost natural, almost as if the world had decided to let her stay, and the soft hum of the monitor had become background rather than focus. A gentle reassurance instead of a question, and Rex lay nearby, his body angled toward both Ethan and the child, not alert, not tense, but quietly protective in a way that did not need to be seen to be understood. And from time to time his ears would shift, catching sounds beyond the room, distant footsteps, a passing voice, the subtle changes of a place that never truly slept. But he did not move, because whatever had drawn him here had not yet released him. And Ethan noticed that too, the way Rex remained anchored, the way his instincts had not faded with the passing hours. And it reminded him of something he had learned long ago, that sometimes the mission does not end when the danger passes. Sometimes it ends when the purpose is fulfilled. And he was beginning to understand that they were not there by accident, not at all. And the thought settled into him without resistance, without the need to question it. And he leaned forward slightly, his hand resting once more beside Hope's, not touching, not guiding, just present. And after a moment her fingers moved again, slower this time, more deliberate, brushing lightly against his skin before curling gently, as if recognizing something familiar, something safe. And Ethan felt the contact without reacting, allowing it to remain simple, allowing it to be enough. And across the room a nurse entered quietly, checking the readings with practiced ease, her expression calm, her movements efficient but softened by the awareness of what this room had witnessed. And she glanced briefly at Ethan and Rex before returning her attention to Hope, adjusting the blanket slightly, ensuring the warmth remained steady. And as she worked she spoke in a low voice, not directed at anyone in particular, but carrying through the space. She is holding stronger each hour. And the words did not feel like an announcement. They felt like confirmation, something already known, something already unfolding. And Ethan nodded faintly, his gaze never leaving the child, because he could see it too, not in numbers, not in charts, but in the subtle strength of her breathing, the quiet determination in the way her body no longer seemed to struggle against itself. And when the nurse finished she paused for just a moment, her eyes softening as she looked at the small scene before her. The man, the dog, the child, and something unspoken passed through her expression before she stepped away, leaving the room once more to its quiet rhythm. And Ethan shifted slightly in his chair, not from discomfort, but from the realization that time had moved forward again without him noticing, that hours had passed not in waiting, but in being present. And he rested his forearms lightly against his knees, his posture grounded, steady, and he allowed himself to breathe deeply, fully, not bracing, not preparing, just breathing. And Rex lifted his head at that moment, his gaze moving toward Ethan, holding there for a second longer than usual. And in that look there was something different, not urgency, not warning, but something closer to completion, as if the tension that had guided him through the night had finally eased into certainty. And Ethan saw it, felt it, and he reached down, his hand resting briefly against the side of Rex's neck, fingers pressing gently into the familiar fur. And for a moment the connection between them felt stronger than it had in years, not because it had changed, but because it had been reaffirmed, proven again in a way that did not need explanation. And Rex responded with a slow exhale, his body relaxing fully, his head lowering back to the floor as his eyes softened. And Ethan understood then, without needing to say it, that whatever Rex had sensed from the beginning had reached its turning point, that the outcome was no longer uncertain in the same way. And he looked back at Hope, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, the quiet movement of her fingers, and he felt something settle inside him, not relief, not triumph, but something quieter, something more lasting, a sense that this moment, This place had changed him in a way that would not fade, and outside the window the city lights flickered softly, distant and unaware, while inside the room the quiet continued, uninterrupted, and Ethan leaned back slightly, his shoulders easing, his mind no longer pulled between past and present, because the past had finally loosened its grip, replaced by something he could hold on to without fear, and as the night moved forward he remained there, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he had chosen this place, this moment, this connection, and Rex slept more deeply now, his breathing slow and even, the watch he had kept finally complete, and hope rested between them, small but steady, a life that had not been lost, a story that had not ended, and in the quiet stillness of that room, with nothing left to prove and nothing left to question, Ethan understood that sometimes the most important things do not arrive with noise or force, they arrive quietly, in moments that seem small but carry everything, and they ask only one thing in return, that you stay long enough to see them through. The next morning did not feel like a continuation of the same story. It felt like something had quietly turned a page, not with sound or announcement, but with a subtle shift in the air that made everything seem just a little more certain. And when the first light touched the room again, it no longer revealed fragility alone. It revealed presence, and Ethan Cole noticed it before anyone said a word. The way Hope's breathing had settled into a rhythm that did not falter between moments, the way her small hands moved without hesitation, not searching blindly anymore, but reacting, responding, as if the world had become something she could begin to understand. And he leaned slightly forward in his chair, his eyes steady, observing not with fear now, but with quiet attention, the kind that does not rush to interpret, only to witness, and Rex stirred as the light shifted, lifting his head slowly, stretching with a long, deliberate motion before rising to his feet, his posture relaxed but purposeful, and he stepped closer to the bed once more, his presence calm, familiar, as if returning to a place he already knew belonged to him. And Hope moved again at the sound of him, not startled, not uncertain, but aware, her fingers curling slightly before reaching outward, and for a moment they hovered in the air, small, searching, until they brushed lightly against the edge of the blanket where Rex stood, and the contact lingered just long enough to be real, just long enough to matter. And Rex remained still, not reacting, not shifting, simply allowing the connection to exist without interruption, and Ethan watched this quietly, something in his expression softening further, because he understood now that these moments were not accidental. They were part of something unfolding in its own time, something that did not need explanation to be true, and the door opened softly behind him, a nurse entering with a calm presence that matched the room, her steps measured, her voice low as she greeted them, and she moved to check the monitor, her eyes scanning the numbers before settling on Hope with a faint nod. And there was something different in her posture today, not caution, not surprise, but a quiet confidence that had not been there before, and she adjusted the blanket gently before turning toward Ethan. "She is responding very well," she said, her tone steady. "Better than we expected at this point." And Ethan nodded, not asking how or why, because those questions no longer held the same weight, and the nurse hesitated for a moment before adding, "Sometimes we see recovery, but this is something more consistent." And she did not finish the thought, because she did not need to, and Ethan understood what she meant without needing the words, and Rex shifted slightly at the sound of her voice, his gaze moving briefly toward her before returning to Hope, as if acknowledging the presence of others, but remaining focused on what mattered, and the nurse offered a small, almost imperceptible smile before stepping back, allowing the quiet to settle again, and Ethan leaned forward once more, resting his forearms lightly against his knees, his hand near Hope's, and this time when her fingers moved they found his more easily, not by chance, but with a small, steady motion that felt intentional, and he did not react outwardly, but something inside him shifted again, something that felt less like surprise and more like recognition, and he let his hand remain there, allowing the contact to exist without forcing it into anything more, because he had learned now that presence was enough, and time moved forward without urgency, the morning blending into something softer, something steadier, and outside the window the world continued as it always did, cars passing, people moving, unaware of the quiet transformation taking place within these walls. And inside the room, the atmosphere remained unchanged, calm, grounded, held together not by control, but by something more subtle, something that did not need to be seen to be felt. And Ethan found himself thinking less about what had brought them here and more about what would come next, not in a way that demanded answers, but in a way that allowed possibility to exist. And for the first time in a long while, the thought of what came next did not feel like something to brace against. It felt like something he could step into. And Rex lowered himself again near the bed, his body relaxed, his breathing slow, no longer carrying the quiet tension that had defined him the night before, and Ethan noticed that too. The way Rex had changed, not in who he was, but in what he carried, as if the weight he had held had been released now that its purpose had been fulfilled, and Ethan reached down briefly, his hand resting against Rex's shoulder in a simple gesture that needed no explanation. And Rex responded with a slight shift closer, grounding, steady, always present, and hope rested between them, no longer fragile in the same way, still small, still new, but undeniably here, undeniably part of the moment. And as the light continued to grow, filling the room with a warmth that had not been there before, Ethan allowed himself a quiet breath, not because everything was certain, but because for the first time uncertainty did not feel like something to fear. It felt like something that could be carried, something that could be walked through without losing what mattered. And he remained where he was, not waiting, not watching for signs, just present, fully present. And in that stillness, with nothing demanding his attention and nothing pulling him away, he understood that some moments are not meant to be explained or defined. They are meant to be lived, fully, quietly, without resistance, and this was one of them. The day moved forward with a quiet certainty that did not need to announce itself, and by the time the afternoon light settled gently across the room, something subtle but undeniable had taken root, not just in hope, not just in the steady rhythm of her breathing or the quiet strength in her small movements, but in Ethan Cole himself, in the way he sat, in the way he no longer watched the monitors as if they held all the answers, but instead watched her, truly watched her, as if presence had become more important than proof. And Rex remained close as always, though there was a noticeable ease in him now, a softness in the way he carried himself, as if whatever unseen burden had guided him to that alley had finally lifted, leaving behind only what mattered. And hope rested between them, no longer defined by fragility, but by something quieter, something stronger, a presence that did not demand attention but held it anyway. And Ethan leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his hand near hers, not reaching, not guiding, simply there. And when her fingers moved, they found his again, not by chance, not by accident, but with a small, deliberate motion that felt almost like recognition. And he allowed it, allowed the contact to remain simple, steady, enough. And for a moment, everything in the room seemed to pause, not in stillness, but in alignment, as if all the small, quiet pieces had settled into place without needing to be forced. And a doctor entered quietly, his steps measured, his presence no longer carrying the weight of uncertainty that had marked the earlier hours. And he reviewed the chart with a brief glance before looking toward Ethan, his expression thoughtful, almost reflective. "She is progressing well," he said, his voice calm. But there was something beneath it, something unspoken, and Ethan nodded, not asking for details, not seeking confirmation, because he could see it, he could feel it. And the doctor hesitated for a moment before adding, "We have run every test we can, and there is no clear explanation for how quickly she stabilized." And the words hung lightly in the air, not heavy, not dramatic, just honest. And Ethan glanced briefly at Rex, then back at Hope, and he gave a quiet response. "Maybe not everything needs one." And the doctor did not argue, did not attempt to correct or clarify. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging that some things fall outside the lines they are trained to follow. And he stepped back, leaving the room once more to its quiet rhythm. And as the door closed softly behind him, Ethan exhaled slowly, not from tension, but from something deeper, something that felt like acceptance. And he shifted slightly in his chair, his posture relaxing further, no longer held by the need to anticipate what might go wrong, because for the first time he was not waiting for something to break. He was allowing something to continue, and Rex stretched slowly, rising to his feet before stepping closer again, his head lowering near the edge of the bed, his presence calm, grounded, and Hope moved slightly at the sound, her small hand lifting just enough to brush against the air before settling again, and Rex remained still, allowing the moment to exist without interruption, and Ethan watched them both, the quiet connection, the steady presence, and something in him shifted again, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to change the way he saw what was happening, enough to move him from witness to something more involved, something more permanent, and the thought did not come as a decision, not yet, but as a realization that this moment was not something he would walk away from, that whatever came next, whatever path unfolded from here, he was already part of it, and he reached down briefly, his hand resting against Rex's neck, fingers pressing gently into the familiar fur, grounding himself in something that had never failed him, and Rex responded with a quiet stillness, a presence that did not need to move to be felt, and outside the window the light began to soften again, the day slowly giving way to evening, and inside the room the rhythm remained steady, unchanged, and Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze moving once more to Hope, to the small life that had shifted everything without asking permission, without needing to be understood, and he allowed himself a quiet moment, not filled with thought, not filled with memory, but simply with presence, and in that moment he understood something he had not been able to before, that not every battle is meant to be fought, some are meant to be held, carried quietly until they resolve themselves in ways no one can predict, and he had spent years preparing for conflict, for control, for outcomes that could be shaped by force or decision. But this was different. This required something else entirely, something quieter, something steadier, something closer to faith than certainty. And as the room settled once more into its calm, with Rex resting nearby and Hope breathing softly, Ethan realized that he was no longer standing at the edge of something uncertain. He was already inside it, already part of it, and for the first time in a long while, that did not feel like something to fear. It felt like something to hold on to, something worth staying for. The evening returned once more, but this time it did not carry the weight of uncertainty. It carried a quiet sense of continuation, as if what had begun in darkness had now found its place in the light and was no longer searching for permission to remain. And Ethan Cole sat where he had chosen to stay, no longer measuring time by hours or minutes, but by the steady rhythm of something that had proven it could endure. And Hope rested peacefully, her breathing no longer fragile, no longer hesitant, but settled into a pattern that felt natural, as if her body had finally remembered what it was meant to do, and the small movements she made now carried a different kind of meaning, not signals of survival, but signs of presence. And Ethan watched these changes with a quiet attention that had replaced the tension he once carried, his gaze steady, his posture relaxed, and beside him Rex remained close, his body at ease, his breathing slow, no longer holding the alert stillness that had defined him at the beginning. And yet there was still something in the way he stayed, something deliberate, something chosen, as if he understood that even when the urgency fades, the purpose remains. And Ethan reached down briefly, his hand resting against Rex's shoulder, fingers pressing gently into the familiar fur, grounding himself in that connection. Once more, and Rex responded with a subtle shift closer, a quiet acknowledgement that did not need to be expressed, and across the room a nurse entered, her steps light, her presence calm, and she moved through her routine with a quiet confidence, checking the monitor, adjusting the blanket, noting the small improvements that had continued throughout the day, and when she finished she paused for a moment, looking at Hope, then at Ethan, and there was something in her expression that spoke not of surprise anymore, but of respect, as if what had happened here had become something she would carry beyond this room, something she would remember, and she offered a small nod before stepping out again, leaving the space to its steady rhythm, and Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes moving once more to Hope, to the quiet rise and fall of her chest, to the small, deliberate movements of her fingers, and he allowed himself to take it in fully, not as something temporary, not as something uncertain, but as something real, something that had moved beyond the edge it once stood on, and he felt a shift inside him, not sudden, not overwhelming, but clear, a recognition that this moment was no longer about what had been saved, but about what would be carried forward, and the thought did not come with questions, it came with a quiet certainty, and he spoke softly, not to be heard, not to be answered, just to let the words exist. "You are not going anywhere," and the words settled into the space without echo, without demand, simply becoming part of what was already there, and Hope moved slightly at the sound, her small hand lifting just enough to brush against the blanket before settling again, and Ethan watched that movement with a faint softness in his expression, because even the smallest responses now carried meaning, and Rex lifted his head briefly, his gaze moving between Ethan and the child, as if acknowledging the shift that had taken place, and then he lowered himself again, resting fully, no longer holding anything back, and outside the window the last light of the day faded into the quiet glow of evening, the world beyond continuing in its own rhythm. Unaware of the small, profound change that had taken place within these walls, and inside the room the calm remained, unbroken, steady, and Ethan found himself no longer thinking about leaving, no longer considering what waited beyond this space, because for the first time in a long while, there was nothing pulling him away, nothing demanding his attention elsewhere, and he realized that staying was no longer a decision he needed to make. It had already been made, somewhere between the moment Rex stopped in that alley and the moment Hope's hand had first moved, and everything since then had simply been the unfolding of that choice. And he leaned forward slightly once more, his hand resting beside hers, allowing the quiet contact to remain, allowing the moment to continue without interruption. And he understood now that this was not something he had found. It was something he had been brought into, something that had chosen him just as much as he had chosen to stay. And as the evening settled deeper, with Rex resting nearby and Hope breathing steadily, Ethan allowed himself to simply be there, fully present, without expectation, without fear, and in that stillness he realized something that had taken him years to understand, that sometimes the most important things in life do not come with warning or explanation. They arrive quietly, in moments that seem small but carry everything. And they do not ask for strength or control. They ask for something much simpler, something much harder. They ask that you stay, that you remain, that you choose not to walk away. And this time, Ethan knew he would not. The night settled once more, but it no longer felt like something to endure. It felt like something that held the quiet continuation of everything that had begun, and Ethan Cole remained seated beside the bed, his posture steady, his presence no longer defined by urgency or even decision, but by something deeper, something that had already taken root and did not need to be questioned. And Hope rested peacefully, her breathing soft but consistent, her small body no longer caught between struggle and stillness, but moving gently within its own rhythm, as if she had crossed a threshold no one could see but everyone in that room could feel. And Rex lay close as always, his body relaxed, his breathing even, no longer carrying the invisible tension that had once guided him. And yet there was still something in the way he stayed, something intentional, something that suggested that even in rest he remained aware of what mattered. And Ethan leaned forward slightly, his hand resting near Hope's, not reaching, not guiding, simply there, allowing the quiet presence to remain. And her fingers moved once more, slower now, steadier, brushing lightly against his hand before curling gently, as if holding on to something she did not yet understand. And Ethan felt it without reacting outwardly, allowing the moment to exist without forcing meaning into it, because he had learned that not everything needed to be defined to be real. And the room remained quiet, the soft hum of the monitor blending into the background, no longer demanding attention, no longer carrying the weight it once had. And a nurse entered briefly, her movements calm, her expression warm but composed, and she checked the readings with a practiced ease before looking toward Ethan, offering a small nod that carried more than reassurance. It carried acknowledgement, and she spoke softly. "She continues to improve." And the words felt simple, but they settled deeply, because they were no longer surprising, they were expected. And Ethan nodded in return, his gaze never leaving Hope, because what he saw before him did not need confirmation, it needed presence. And the nurse lingered for just a moment longer, her eyes moving between the man, the dog, and the child. And there was something in her expression that suggested she understood that what had happened here would not remain within these walls, that it would follow them, shape them, remain with them in ways that could not be measured. And then she stepped away quietly, leaving the room once more to its steady rhythm. And Ethan leaned back slightly, his shoulders easing as he allowed himself to simply be there, without expectation, without anticipation, just present. And Rex shifted closer, his body angling slightly toward the bed, his head resting near Ethan's foot, grounding, steady, always there. And for a moment, everything in the room felt aligned, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that felt complete. And Ethan allowed his gaze to soften, taking in the small details, the faint movement of Hope's fingers, the gentle rise and fall of her chest, the quiet stillness of Rex beside him. And he realized that this moment, this quiet, unremarkable moment, held more meaning than anything else that had come before it, because it was not defined by crisis, it was defined by continuation. And he spoke again, his voice low, steady, not asking, not promising, just stating what had already become true. You are staying. And the words did not echo, did not demand response. They simply became part of the space, and Hope stirred slightly at the sound, her hand moving again, brushing lightly against his before settling once more. And Rex lifted his head briefly, his gaze moving toward Ethan, holding there for a moment before returning to the child, as if acknowledging the shift that had already taken place. And Ethan reached down, his hand resting briefly against Rex's neck, fingers pressing gently into the familiar fur, grounding himself once more in that connection. And Rex responded with a quiet stillness, his presence unwavering. And outside the window the night deepened, the city lights flickering softly in the distance, unaware of the quiet transformation that had taken place within this small room. And inside the calm remained unbroken, steady, certain. And Ethan found himself no longer thinking about what had been lost, no longer feeling the pull of moments he could not change, because something in him had shifted, something had been restored, not through force, not through effort, but through a quiet series of moments that had unfolded exactly as they needed to. And he understood now that this was not about redemption, not about correcting the past. It was about presence, about choosing to remain when it mattered, about recognizing that sometimes the most important thing you can do is not to act, but to stay. And as the night continued, with Rex resting nearby, and Hope breathing softly, Ethan remained there, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he had found where he needed to be. And in that stillness, with nothing demanding his attention and nothing pulling him away, he realized that this was no longer just a moment in time. It was something that would continue, something that would carry forward, something that had already begun to shape what came next. And for the first time in a long while, that did not feel uncertain. It felt right. The night carried on with a quiet grace that no longer felt fragile, as if something invisible had settled over the room and chosen to remain. And Ethan Cole sat there without shifting, not because he had to, but because there was nowhere else he needed to be. And Hope rested peacefully beneath the soft glow of the dim light, her breathing steady, her small chest rising and falling with a rhythm that no longer questioned itself. And there was a difference now, something subtle but undeniable, not just in her strength, but in the way the room held her, in the way everything around her seemed to move with quiet respect. And Rex lay close as always, his body relaxed, his breathing slow, but there was still a quiet awareness in him, something that did not fade even in rest. And from time to time his ears would shift slightly, responding to sounds beyond the walls. But he did not rise, he did not move away, because whatever had brought him here had already completed its path. And Ethan noticed that, the way Rex no longer held that tension, the way his presence had softened into something steady and certain. And he reached down briefly, his hand resting against the dog's neck, fingers pressing gently into the familiar fur, grounding himself in that connection once more. And Rex responded with a slow exhale, his body settling even deeper, as if acknowledging that the moment they had carried together had found its end. And Ethan looked back at Hope, his gaze steady, no longer searching for signs, no longer measuring progress, just seeing her as she was, present, here. And something in him shifted again, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to settle into a truth he could no longer ignore, that this was not something temporary, not something that would fade when the moment passed. This was something that had already become part of him, part of what would come next, and he leaned forward slightly, his hand resting near hers, not touching, not guiding, simply there, and her fingers moved once more, slow, deliberate, brushing lightly against his skin before curling gently, and he allowed the contact to remain without interruption, without forcing it into anything more. Because he understood now that presence was enough, and across the room the door opened quietly, and the social worker returned, her presence calm, her expression thoughtful, and she stepped inside with a gentle nod, acknowledging the stillness of the space before speaking, her voice low but clear. "We have begun the process," she said, and Ethan looked up, meeting her gaze, not with uncertainty, but with a quiet readiness. And she continued, choosing her words carefully. "There has been no claim, no report, no one has come forward." And the words did not carry judgment. They carried reality, and Ethan listened without reacting, because part of him had already understood this, already felt it in the quiet absence that had surrounded hope since the beginning. And the social worker hesitated briefly before adding, "We will ensure she is placed in a safe and caring environment." And Ethan's gaze shifted back to hope, to the small life that had already anchored itself into his world. Without asking permission, and for a moment he did not speak, not because he did not know what to say, but because the words he needed were not complicated, they were simple, and he allowed the silence to hold for just a second longer before he spoke, his voice steady, grounded. "She already is." And the social worker did not respond immediately, not out of disagreement, but because she understood what he meant, and there was something in her expression that softened, something that recognized that this situation was no longer just procedural, it was personal, and she nodded slowly, not confirming, not denying, just acknowledging, and Ethan looked back at Hope, his hand still near hers, his presence unwavering, and Rex lifted his head slightly, his gaze moving between Ethan and the social worker, as if observing the exchange without needing to interpret it, and then he lowered himself again, resting, because whatever decision was being formed did not require his guidance anymore. It required something else, something human, and the room fell quiet once more after the social worker stepped back, leaving space for the moment to settle, and Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, his shoulders easing as he allowed himself to fully accept what had already begun, that this was no longer about rescue, no longer about survival. It was about what came after, about what was chosen, and he realized that he had already made that choice somewhere along the way, not in a single moment, but in every moment he had stayed, every moment he had not walked away, and he looked at Hope again, at the quiet strength in her breathing, at the small, deliberate movements of her hands, and he understood that she was no longer something he had found. She was someone he would not leave, and Rex remained beside him, calm, steady, no longer carrying the urgency of the beginning, but still present, still part of the quiet truth that had unfolded. And outside the window the night stretched on, the city lights steady and distant, unaware of the decision that had taken shape within this room, and inside the calm remained unbroken. And Ethan sat there, not waiting, not questioning, just present, fully present. And in that stillness, with nothing demanding his attention and nothing pulling him away, he understood something that did not need to be spoken, that sometimes the greatest acts are not the ones that begin a story, but the ones that choose to continue it. And this time, he would. The morning that followed did not arrive like the others. It came with a quiet clarity that felt less like a beginning and more like an answer that had been forming all along. And the room where Ethan Cole sat no longer carried the weight of uncertainty or even transition. It carried something steadier, something resolved, and Hope rested peacefully beneath the soft light, her breathing calm and even, her small movements no longer tentative but natural, as if she had settled fully into the life that had once been so fragile. And Ethan remained beside her, not as someone waiting for the next moment, but as someone who had already stepped into it, his presence grounded, his posture steady, his gaze no longer searching but simply seeing. And Rex lay close as always, his body relaxed, his breathing slow, no longer carrying the quiet vigilance of the night that had brought them here, but still present, still connected, as if even in rest he remained part of something larger than himself. And Ethan reached down briefly, his hand resting against Rex's neck, fingers pressing gently into the familiar fur, and Rex responded with a slow, quiet movement closer, grounding, steady, always there. And across the room the door opened softly, and the social worker stepped in once more, her presence calm, her expression thoughtful but certain, and she moved with a quiet purpose that matched the tone of the room, and she approached Ethan with a gentle nod before speaking, her voice steady. "We have reviewed everything," she said, and Ethan looked up, meeting her gaze without hesitation, because something in him had already prepared for this moment, not through thought, but through presence, and she continued, choosing her words carefully but without delay. "There have been no claims, no reports, no indication that anyone is coming forward," and the words settled into the space. Without weight, without judgment, simply as truth, and she paused briefly before adding, "Given the circumstances, we would like to discuss the possibility of placement," and Ethan's gaze shifted back to Hope, to the quiet rise and fall of her chest, to the small life that had already become something more than a moment, and he did not rush to answer, not because he needed time, but because the answer was not something that needed to be formed. It had already taken shape long before the question was asked, and he leaned forward slightly, his hand resting once more near Hope's, and her fingers moved again, brushing lightly against his skin, a small, steady contact that felt less like coincidence and more like confirmation, and Ethan allowed a quiet breath to settle in his chest before he spoke, his voice calm, grounded, certain. "She is not going anywhere," and the words did not rise, did not demand attention. They simply existed, solid and unwavering, and the social worker watched him for a moment, not with surprise, not with hesitation, but with understanding, and she nodded slowly, as if recognizing that this decision had not been made in a single moment, but in every moment that had come before it, and she spoke again, her tone softer now. "Then we will begin the process," and there was no resistance in her voice, no need to explain, only acknowledgement, and she stepped back slightly, allowing the space to remain what it had become, a place of quiet certainty rather than transition, and Ethan remained where he was, his hand still near Hope's, his presence unchanged, and Rex lifted his head briefly, his gaze moving between Ethan and the social worker, as if observing the exchange, and then he lowered himself again, resting fully, because whatever had been set into motion had now reached its natural conclusion, and the room settled once more into its steady rhythm, no longer defined by what might happen next, but by what had already been chosen, and Ethan looked at Hope, not as someone he had found, not as someone he had saved, but as someone who had become part of his life in a way that could not be undone, and he allowed himself a small, quiet moment, not filled with thought, not filled with memory, but simply with presence, and he understood then that this was not a story that ended with a miracle, it was a story that continued because of one, and that the miracle itself had never been the moment her breathing returned. It had been every moment after, every quiet decision to stay, every steady breath that followed, every small movement that confirmed she was still here. And Rex shifted slightly beside him, his body relaxed, his presence unchanged, and Ethan reached down once more, his hand resting against the dog's shoulder, grounding himself in the bond that had carried him here, and Rex responded with a quiet stillness, as if acknowledging that their part in this had been fulfilled. And outside the window the morning light grew stronger, filling the room with a warmth that felt natural, unforced, and inside the calm remained unbroken, steady, certain, and Ethan sat there, not waiting, not wondering, just present, fully present, and in that stillness he understood something that no words could fully capture, that sometimes the smallest acts, the quietest choices, are the ones that carry the greatest weight, not because they change everything all at once, but because they change what comes next. And as Hope rested peacefully and Rex remained beside him, Ethan knew without question, without hesitation, that this was where he was meant to be, and this time, he had not arrived too late.